Can we turn to Revelation 14? And can I get someone to read out Revelation 14, verses 9 to 12? And we're going to look at the third angel's message.
And the third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, "If any man worship the beast and his image, and receive his mark in his forehead or in his hand, the same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up for ever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night, who worship the beast and his image, and whosoever receiveth the mark of his name. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus."
This is the final one of the three angels' messages of the everlasting gospel. And when you read through that, like for me, it stands out being very different to what you would normally expect when you think about what is the gospel. And what stands out to people about this message, just reading through it? What are some of the things in there that catch your attention?
It stands out that there's some very clear choices to be made, and it's not they're not light choices, they are very serious choices. In verse 11, they have no rest day nor night. There's such a contrast to the rest that God offers those who trust him.
I guess when it comes to the everlasting gospel, there's another side to it. You know, you've got God's side, but there's somebody else. There's always two sides to a story. And I guess, you know, I was going to say contrast, Petra, and you brought that up. Yeah, it is. It's a contrast between both sides. You know, and yeah.
Mm-hmm. Now, this one, you know, it mentions about, you know, the wrath of God, his indignation, torment with fire and brimstone, the smoke of their torment, no rest day nor night. There's all this judgment, this fire and brimstone, this destruction in this message against those who worship the beast and his image. It's a very strong warning. And sometimes reading this stuff like this, when the Bible says this, that can make people worried or make people, you know, fear that the type of God that we're worshiping, when it says stuff like this, that this is the judgment and the warning that's coming. But I think by the very nature of a warning, that by definition there has to be something there that's scary. You know, if there's not something that's scary, if there's not something that's dangerous, there's no need to have a warning there for it. So any warning that's given has an element of there's something scary on the other side. I actually found a couple of warning signs that I'll share there. I found these two. You know, you see you got one there with a landmine, You know, when I went over to Israel, there were areas where there were landmines and there were signs, not exactly like this one, that's a little more pictorial, but there were big, clear signs saying landmines, you know, in this area. And it's you know, it's warning you of something very serious and very dangerous. But one of the things, thinking about the warnings that's given there, is there's a couple of things. Firstly, what's beyond that sign is dangerous. That is scary. Walking through an area where there are landmines, every step could be your last. That's something that's very dangerous, very scary. And so that's what the sign's warning us about. But the interesting thing that occurred to me is when you're actually there reading the sign, you know, when you're on that side of it reading that sign, you're actually somewhere that's safe. And the warning sign is put there so we know the line between what is safe and what is dangerous. If you're on this side of that warning sign, you're safe. If you're on the other side, you're in danger. And so the warning, although it warns us of something that is fearful, it's not there to scare us. It's there to show us the line between where is safe and where is dangerous, and where we can be at peace, and where, you know, if we were on the other side of that, then it would be a reason to be scared. And it's same with the other high voltage box, where there was a little caption that went on with this one that originally that just had the top danger sticker, and the inspector came along and said it was too small, they needed a bigger one. So they added the bottom one, danger, not only will it kill you, it will hurt the whole time you're dying. But again, when we're here reading that sign, we're somewhere that's safe. It's only if you go on the other side of that, if you open that box and reach on the inside, that you go somewhere where it's dangerous. Petra.
Yeah, I really like those signs, especially the one on the right. The will hurt the whole time. That is so relevant to sin. Yeah. The other thing is the wrath of God is at what is harming people. You know, it's not, God cares that people are safe and happy. The people who put those signs up, they care that people are safe and well. So you could say those people are scaring people by putting the signs up, but they're actually trying to help people. God is bringing an end to this to help people with anger at what has hurt so many people. So it depends on how you look at it. You know, it's the painting of God waiting to annihilate people. No, he's not. He's waiting to get rid of what's causing a problem for people.
Galen.
It's kind of like he's just going on from your comment there, Petra. It's like he's going around clearing out the landmines. What I noticed with the signs, especially that it was more obvious with the first one, where it says stay alive, stay out. Yes, there's a line, but you also have a choice. You know, you can choose to ignore the sign and carry on walking, and the consequences are your own. Or you can choose to, you know, take heed of the sign and abide by the suggestion it's making, or the warning that it's putting there, whether it be, you know, okay, there's landmines here, or, you know, keep the door shut on the cabinet. But either way, the sign is there to warn us, but we still have a choice to abide by what it says or not.
The other thing is that if there wasn't a time of judgment, a time where all this would end, then all the ugliness and torment of sin goes on forever. So this is a necessary thing to end that. And at least God is warning people. It's not like he's not telling people and then next thing it's in their face and it's too late. You know, the whole Bible is there to say, hey, you have a choice. You don't have to be on the wrong side of this.
I did hear of, or did read somewhere, it might have been a picture on the internet or something, but someone wrote in graffiti on a wall and said, you know, have you read my book? There will be a test, God, you know, it's signed by God, which is an interesting way of putting it.
Mhm. Just carrying on from that, I think something else that sort of sets how serious and how severe the warning has to be. That depends on really two things. That is the well, that's the danger, which is a combination of what will happen if it's ignored, and what is the likelihood of someone doing that. Like, for example, got a new puppy. We go taking it for walks. Occasionally, it just wants to cross the road and run across the road. And if it does that, it gets a big tug on the lead and it gets growled at sternly. Because what happens if it gets hit by a car? It's dead. What is the likelihood that it's going to get hit by a car if it just runs out into a busy road? Well, it's quite high. So because of that, the warning needs to be quite severe so it learns, no, don't do that. You know, if it's, you know, something else, you know, if it wants to play on the edge of a deck and it's going to fall off the deck, you know, I tell it to stay away from the deck, but if it falls off, okay, it's not really going to get injured. It might hurt itself a little bit, but it doesn't need such a harsh warning because it's not such a dangerous thing. So when we look at the warning God's given here, the two questions we've got to ask is, well, what are the consequences? What's going to happen? What is the danger that's involved here? You know, it's talks about the loss of salvation, the wrath that's being poured out for the punishment of sin, the judgment of Babylon, and the destruction of the wicked. It's a fairly serious punishment. But the next thing you got to look at is what are the likelihood that people will go down that road if they don't take heed to the warning. And with that, can I get someone to read Matthew 24, verse 24? And this is Jesus speaking about the final end time deceptions that we'll face, which is, you know, what Revelation is speaking on as well. What is the likelihood that Jesus says here that people will be deceived if they don't take heed to the warning?
Right. That's the verse I thought of as it says, "For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall do great signs and wonders, and so much that if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect."
Yep.
Matthew 24:24.
Yep, that's the one. Were you just quoting that?
Um, yeah, it's reading.
Oh, yep. Yeah. So there Jesus says, if it were possible, it should deceive the very elect. So the question is, what are the chances that people will be deceived into following Babylon?
Very high.
Yeah.
And not from a clear choice. It'll be being deceived into that path. You know,
Hmm.
that's quite different than if somebody comes and says, look, there's these two options here. I really recommend this one. I really, really think it'll work well for you. Will you take it? That's very different to deceiving people into it. And your own intellect isn't going to save you here.
Mm-hmm. And going along with that, can someone read Revelation 13, verse 8?
And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world.
So again, that same question. What is the likelihood of people being, led astray, of people falling into the trap of Babylon and following the beast?
There's one thing that's clear from that verse is staying with the majority is not going to be safety here.
Hmm.
Yeah, quite the opposite. You're right, John.
It's actually something I noticed when I was at primary school. I used to play various games of it was sort of like tag, but just one person's in, and as you catch somebody, then they're also in, and eventually you get everyone's in, and they're just trying to get the last person. And especially if you were playing tackle, you had to actually tackle them to the ground, and when you tackled them, then they were in as well. Because you always hear, safety in numbers, and that's what animals do. They always run the herd, but the predators try to separate someone off and go for it. But I don't know why, but I always found it was always safer to leave the group. I don't know if it was just kids or if people think differently than animals, but if there was, let's say it's at the point where there's 5 people that are in trying to tackle, when there's like 20 people that are trying to get away, they always go in a big group and run around. And if you just left the group, then all the other people that are in are still chasing people in the group trying to get them, and you're just being you just often you'd be the last one in just because you didn't side with the majority. It was easier to stay standing not being with the majority, because I don't know why it is. Maybe it's people think differently than animals. Animals always, it's always the ones by themselves that get picked off sooner. But for some reason, in all those games, it was most dangerous being with the majority.
Maybe people are lazier than animals, and if you go for the group, there's a more likelihood you'll get someone. Energy saving. The thing that's clear in this verse, Revelation 13:8, is that there is only one way to not get caught up in this. It's not like make your own path. It's if you don't want that, then there's this, and that's your choice.
There's only one way to be safe. Yeah. And so when we ask the question, what's the likelihood of people wandering after the beast? Well, it's 100% of those who don't take heed to the warning. If there's a landmine sign You know, and there's a chance you could walk through the area and not step on anything, right? But there's not a chance that you could walk through this world and not get caught up in the beast if you don't pay heed to the warning. There's no way you can walk through that land and not fall victim to Babylon. And that universality of it is one of the reasons why the warning comes so strongly, because all the world will wander after the beast. If it were possible, even the very elect would be deceived. And it's sort of, this is an emphasis that carries on down in verse 16 when it talks about those that receive the mark. It's because of all, both small and great, rich and poor, bond and free. You know, it's emphasizing that it doesn't matter who they are or where they are in the world, everyone gets it. And later on in Revelation 17 and 18, it mentions a number of times all the kings of the earth followed after it, all the merchants of the earth. You know, all the nations were deceived by the sorceries. All of them that dwell on the earth. This is what's emphasized again and again and again. Petra.
So the warning, the strength of the warning here is also relevant because it's clear by the impact of the verses that we're looking at on most people that this is a powerful force that is drawing them on the path to destruction. This is not something light and simple. This is a strong, powerful, effective force. You know, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but principalities and powers. So the strong warning is also appropriate because of that.
Absolutely. I mean, like if I don't know, let's say Jesse was fixing a radio or something, and he's got the circuit, and there's a capacitor there that's sort of charged. And if you touch it, it'll give you a little electric shock. You know, just nothing too serious, just a little shock, right? You sit down at the table to do something, he's going to say, hey, don't touch this, it's charged, you'll get a shock, right? Just a casual thing, you know, and you're like, all right, cool, I'm not going to touch it. I'll stay away from the table. Okay. But let's say he was fixturing the wiring at the house, connecting main volts to the house, and he sees you going up about to touch that wire. He's not going to be like, hey, yeah, don't want to touch that wire. It's 240 main volts going to kill you. You know, you'd get a shout, you go, oh, stop, don't touch that. You know, the severity of the thing is, you know, does he just tell you in a calm voice, hey, don't touch that, you'll get a shock? Or is it yelling, don't touch that, you'll die? And so the almost the harshness, the severity of the warning that God gives here under the third angel's message reflects the seriousness of what's facing this world. And one of the things, you know, the fact that Babylon is so universal, it deceives the whole world. The whole world goes after that, thinking that it's a good thing, thinking that Babylon is safe. And in order to break through a delusion that strong, you need a message equally as strong. And so that's what God gives here. Now, we're gonna split this message into a couple of sections. Yes, Petra.
There's also, and I guess we have sort of covered it, but there's also the thing, this impacts almost all of the world. Almost all of the world is deceived. Now, usually with deceptions, you can deceive a few people here and there. You might deceive quite a few people, but to deceive that many and that range of people, that's also something that's pretty full on and intense. this power that is opposing God and wanting to take people down is powerful enough to deceive everybody on the face of this earth unless you're safe in God's hands. That is not something that anybody through their own wisdom or knowledge or learning or even a few of them banding together is going to be able to stand up against.
Mhm. I'm just going to share my screen here. So we've got here the third angel's message in this section. I want to notice sort of the structure of how it's set out. It starts out with this warning: if any man worship the beast or of his image, receive his mark in his right hand, the forehead or right hand. And then one of the last things it says in verse 12 is a very similar statement: whosoever worship the beast in his image will receive his mark, receive the mark of his name. But in between is where we have the warning. So it's don't do this, or this will happen, so don't do this. Is effectively that how it's set up. But it's these two warning parts in the middle. The same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. Now that's the part we're going to look at first. Speaking about the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. We're going to look at a few verses that talk about that talk about the wrath of God. Now, can we turn to Revelation 15? Leading on from this, we get into actually first one question I will ask in that verse that I just read out. The same shall drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. What does it mean that God's wrath is poured out without mixture?
Isn't it usually without mercy? It's not diluted.
Hmm.
And usually with regards to God, there's no mercy left.
Hmm. Now, at what point in this earth's history does God's wrath get poured out without being mixed with mercy? Petra.
Jesse, with an answer still to your last question.
Mm-hmm.
It would be that it was like without restraint,
Yep.
and it's like this is like this is his anger and its fullness,
Mm-hmm.
like without any like just have it pretty much.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so the question following up from that is, where is the time frame in Earth's history where this takes place?
The 7 last plagues. So be after probation is closed.
Yep, after the close of probation, with the 7 last plagues. And that's what we see in chapter 15 and going on to 16 of Revelation. Can somebody read out Revelation 15, verse 1?
And I saw another sign in heaven, great and marvelous, 7 angels having the 7 last plagues, for in them is filled up the wrath of God.
Mhm. So, like you were just saying, it's telling us that the wrath of God is the 7 last plagues, or the wrath of God is filled up in them. When the 7 last plagues are being poured out, the wrath of God is being poured out upon the world. And carrying on down in verse 7, 16, Galen.
So would this also be the time where God says, vengeance is mine, for I am the Lord?
Yeah, and in Revelation 18, when it talks about the judgment of Babylon, it says, as she is dealt to others, so deal to her. She's being punished for her iniquity. That's the time of the Lord's vengeance and judgment upon Babylon. And so here in verse 15, we're introduced to the 7 last plagues, and carrying on reading from verse 7, we have, and one of the 4 beasts gave unto the 7 angels 7 golden vials full of the wrath of God, who liveth forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no man was able to enter into the temple till the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were fulfilled. And I heard a great voice out of the temple saying to the 7 angels, go your way and pour out the vials of the wrath of God upon the earth. So the first part of that warning is dealing with that wrath of God being poured out upon the earth. And there's a number of other passages in Revelation that deal with this, and they all deal with that same time period, that this the 7 last plagues, the destruction of the wicked in the close of probation is the time of this wrath. We see that again in Revelation 19. Revelation 19, can somebody read verse 13 through 16?
And he was clothed with a vesture dipped in blood, and his name is called the Word of God. And the armies which were in heaven followed him upon white horses, clothed in fine linen, white and clean. And out of his mouth goeth a sharp sword, that with it he should smite the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. And he treadeth the winepress of fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. And he hath on his vesture and on his thigh a name written, King of Kings and Lord of Lords.
So again, what's happening in these verses here in Revelation? Who is this depicting, and what's happening?
Jesus' second coming.
Yep. The second coming, the final part of the destruction of the wicked and the plagues. And it describes Jesus at his second coming, treading the winepress of the fierceness of the wrath of Almighty God. Again, it's the time of God's wrath. And it's interesting as well, talking about the winepress here of God's wrath, whereas in the third angel's message, it's drinking the wine of the wrath of God. So it's the same imagery. And even if we jump back to Revelation 14, we know that after the three angels' message, we see the Son of Man coming, riding on the clouds with a sickle to harvest the earth. And can somebody read out for me Revelation 14 and verse 19?
And the angel thrust in his sickle into the earth, and gathered the vine of the earth, and cast it into the great winepress of the wrath of God.
And so again, we're seeing a similar time frame being set through all these things, talking about the wrath of God applying to the destruction that happens and the judgment that happens during the close of probation, leading up to and including the second coming. So as we see here, this bit in purple that deals with the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation, is warning them that if you receive the mark of the beast and worship the beast in his image, the destruction that falls under the seven last plagues will fall on you. The second warning here, I'll put that in green, and he shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever, and they have no rest day nor night. Now this speaks of a sort of a different nature of judgment. Galen.
I'm just thinking the third angel's message talks about, God's, how many pages are sticking together? Oh, come on. The wine of the wrath of God, and poured out without mixture into the cup of his indignation. So the fact that we also have in Revelation 17 verse 4, we also have a woman who has a golden cup in her hand that's also full. So both of them have full cups, but obviously filled with two very different things. But it's just interesting that both of them have a full cup.
Hers is filled with the abominations of her fornication, and a few verses later it says that she's drunk with the blood of the saints. So it's her apostasy, her idolatry, and her fornication. But it's not just that she's personally chosen to walk away from God in apostasy. It's that she's killed all those who have not followed her.
But yeah, I just thought the similarities of both having a full cup, obviously two very different contrasts, but because they're filled with different things, but just the fact that they both have cups and they're both full.
Well, even there in the second angel's message, we're warned against Babylon has fallen, because she made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. And then in the third message, those people that drank of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, that were deceived by her adultery, her idolatries, followed after Babylon, and manifested her wrath and intolerance against God's people who wanted the truth, who persecuted God's people. They've drunken of Babylon's wine and persecuting God's people. Now they're going to drink of God's wine, of his indignation, and be punished for what they have done, and persecuting God's people.
It's almost like saying Like some people, if they catch one of their children smoking, they'll say, right, you want to try this? You either you sit down and you have the whole packet. You want it? I'll give it to you. Or something like that. Where they think, yeah.
There's actually a story in the book of Acts where the Jews dragged Paul in front of a court and accusing him to the judge of stirring up sedition and strife and of teaching things that were contrary to their laws and things like this, and made these accusations against him. And Paul was about to make his defense, and the judge just went, hold on, Paul, just keep quiet. And he turned around to the Jews and he says, I don't care about your religion. He hasn't committed any crimes. Why are you wasting my time? And then the Jews were dragged out of the court and beaten by all the Greeks. And it was sort of just a thing in the law, because they had made this accusation against Paul, wanting him to be punished, to be lashed, to be beaten or whatever, when he hadn't done anything wrong. And so as a response, the punishment that they wanted Paul to suffer, they had to endure. It was turned back upon their own heads. A similar thing happens in the book of Esther with Haman, who wanted to kill all the Jews. But in the end, God turns it around, and Haman's the one that ends up getting hung on his own gallows that he built for Mordecai. Here it's these people, and not just the ones controlling Babylon, but all the ones who joined Babylon and supported it and gave it the ability to persecute God's people. Then the same wrath that was manifest against God's people, that's turned back upon them, and they have to endure God's wrath. But in this third angel's message, it first speaks about God's wrath, drinking the wine of his wrath without mixture into the cup of his indignation. And that's referring to the judgment that falls on the close of probation. But after that, it speaks about being tormented with fire and brimstone. It talks about the smoke of their torment ascending up forever and ever. Now that seems to be, to me anyway, that seems to be speaking of a different judgment. That doesn't sound like the language of the second coming or the plagues. Where does this fit in?
After the 1,000 years.
Yeah, can somebody read Revelation 20 verse 9 and 10? It's Revelation 20 verse 9 and 10.
And they went up on the breadth of the earth and compassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city, and the fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever.
So we see the similar language being used there. What are the parallels between this judgment here at the end of the 1,000 years and the warning in the third angel?
The consequences of not choosing to be in the safety of God's hands is the same.
It's a judgment that lasts forever and ever. And it's also a judgment of fire and brimstone in both passages. Now, what does it mean? Wherein the third angel speaks about the smoke of their torment ascendeth up forever and ever. And here it says, they shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. What does the Bible mean when it tells us that the torment will ascend up forever and ever? Is that talking about an eternal hell, eternal hellfire? How are we to understand this?
With the verse before verse 9, it says that fire came down from God out of heaven and devoured them. Which, when a lion devours its meal, there's usually nothing left.
Hmm.
When we devour a meal, obviously with lions, they're not eating the bones, but there are other animals that go on to finish off the job. If we devour our meals, there's usually nothing left on the plate. And if we're devouring our meals as humans, we tend to eat. It's usually because normally we would eat, but if you're devouring your meal, you're hungry, you're eating fast, probably faster than what we should, and probably eat a bit too much. But you usually keep going till there's nothing left.
Can we turn to Isaiah 34? Now, there's a prophecy of judgment here. In verse 5, Isaiah 34, verse 5, we read that he says, "For my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Edomah and upon the people of my curse to judgment." So speaking about the judgment on the land of Edom. And then he begins to speak of that judgment, of the sword coming, being filled with blood, all this language of what will be destroyed, the great slaughter of the land of Edom. But can I get someone to read from verse 8 to 10? I want us to notice, what is the language when it speaks about the judgment that's falling upon Edom?
For it is the day of the Lord's vengeance, and the year of recompenses for the controversy of Zion. Is it 2:10?
Up to 10 including.
Yeah.
Right.
8, 9, and 10.
Right. 9. And the streams thereof shall be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land thereof shall become burning pitch. It shall not be quenched night nor day. The smoke thereof shall go up forever, from generation to generation. It shall lie waste, none shall pass through it forever and ever.
So notice the language that the destruction of Edom is used. It mentions the land being turned to brimstone, burning pitch or burning tar, it not being quenched day or night, the smoke ascending up forever. This is a lot of the same language that was used back there in Revelation, where it says they have no rest day nor night. The smoke ascendeth forever and ever. There it talks about fire and brimstone. Here it talks about fire and burning pitch. The fire not being quenched. It's a lot of similar language when it speaks of the destruction of Edom. But how do we understand this? Especially, what do we read in the next verse? When God destroyed Edom, was it going to be a place of continual fire? What's the very next thing we read in verse 11?
Well, even in verse 10, that it shall lie waste forever. The impact is forever.
Hmm.
Verse 11, but the cormorant and the bittern shall possess it, the owl also, and the raven shall dwell in it, and he shall stretch out upon it the line of confusion and the stones of emptiness.
So it's saying that it'll be destroyed by this fire, but animals are going to live there and inhabit it. So it's clearly not going to continue burning forever if the animals are going to dwell in it. Galen.
It says there at the beginning of verse 10, it shall not be quenched night nor day. When you quench a fire, you put it out, usually a bucket of water or some such. But if a fire is not quenched, it'll just keep going until the fuel runs out. Like if you've got a fireplace in your house and you light the fire, as long as if you don't quench it, obviously in our fireplaces they can be quenched with a bucket of water. It's not ideal, but or a campfire, you just stick in a bucket of water in. But if you don't do that and just let it go, it'll keep going until there's no more wood to be burnt, until the wood's all been burnt up. So a fire that shall not be quenched is a fire that shall not be put out. But if there's a finite amount of fuel, it will eventually go out. It's the whole fire triangle that you get, fuel, air, and heat. You take any one of those away and it dies out. You quench it by taking away the heat. You can smother it and take away the oxygen, or you take away the fuel by either in a forest fire by adding a break, or you just starve it, and it just eventually goes out on its own.
Yeah, so the destruction of Edom here, it's clearly not wanting us to understand that when it talks about the judgment will last for day and night, the smoke will ascend up forever, the brimstone and the fire that will burn the land will not be quenched. It just means that this destruction will be complete. And the destruction will be complete and it will lie waste from generation to generation, as Petra pointed out. But we know it's not, we can go there today and see that it's not still burning, but it is a wasteland. And the only things living there are the animals, which is what we're told here. So the use of this language is not to say that the fire will continue forever, but the result of that will continue forever. It will be a complete destruction. And so when we jump back into Revelation, 14, we see with this third message that it opens and starts by identifying the thing that it's warning us against, to not worship the beast and his image. It opens and starts with that statement. And then in the middle, there are two warnings. The warning of the judgment that will happen to those people after the close of probation, the destruction in this life. Now, that's not a judgment that lasts forever and ever, because all those who are destroyed in the 7 last plagues will be resurrected. They will rise again in the second resurrection. So while that is that the wrath of God being poured out, that is not a judgment that lasts forever and ever. But they will rise in the second resurrection to face this judgment that is an eternal judgment. So that the warning is given, clearly identified: do not worship the beast and his image, receive his mark in his forehead or in his hands. And we've looked at that previously and identified what these are. And so it clearly identifies what it's warning us against and tells us what will happen. We'll suffer the wrath of God in this life and the fire and brimstone in the next resurrection.